Okay, this week our topic is personal identity. Now, let me try to clarify what the question here that we're asking. The question is, what makes you one and the same person today as you were yesterday? Or more generally, what makes you one and the same person at time one as you are at time two? Now, to clarify, our question is about numerical identity, not about qualitative identity. In other words, um, two items are qualitatively identical if they have all the same qualities. So let's say I drew two red spots on the whiteboard and they're exactly the same size and shape and color. They're qualitatively identical, but there's still two spots on the whiteboard, not just one. On the other hand, if I draw one spot on the whiteboard, it's numerically identical with itself. It is one and the same thing. So our question is, what makes you one and the same person today as you were yesterday? Okay. Now, we're going to look at 5 possible answers to this question, and there may be more of them. The first 3 of them we've already kind of encountered at the end of our discussion of dualism, when we were asking this question about physical parts and souls and organisms. So here's 3 possible answers to the question. You might say that a person is numerically identical at 2 different times if and only if they meet these conditions. Maybe your theory is that the person has all the same physical parts at both times, and that makes them the same person. Maybe your idea is that the person has the same soul at 2 different times, and that's what makes them one and the same person. You might say that a person is the same physical organism at both times, and that's what makes them the same person. Now, those 3 answers we encountered in this argument for dualism from personal identity, which I'll review in a second. Today we're going to look at 2 other possible answers. You might say, like John Locke says, that a person is the same person at 2 different times if they have the same consciousness. Now, what Locke really means there is they have the same memories. So Locke's idea is that if you can remember the stuff you did on Tuesday, then you're the same person today as you were on Tuesday. That's his big idea. We'll talk about that more in a second. And then you might take the very skeptical position of David Hume, which is there is no personal identity. Well, let me back up. Hume would say you are only the same person at 2 different times if you've got the exact same impression of yourself at those 2 different times. But Hume says nobody does have the same impression of anything at 2 different times. So nobody is identical through time. In other words, Hume says, yeah, if you want to be identical with yourself, you'd have to meet this condition, but nobody meets this condition, so no one has identity through time. Okay. Now, let me review here and talk to you about these kind of first 3 views, and by reminding you of this argument for dualism that we saw last week. So the first premise says, if dualism is false, that is, if physicalism is true, then each person is just a chunk of matter. Okay, that seems clear enough. If you don't have any soul, any non-physical part to you, then all that there is to you, all that makes you up is just matter, just physical parts. The cells and the molecules and the atoms and the quarks and whatever else there is. But here's another thing that seems obvious. Premise 2, no person is the same hunk of matter that they were 10 minutes ago or 10 years ago. Why? Because, your body is actually always replacing cells and changing, at least at an atomic level, And so, we hear this common thing, every 7 years, all the cells in your body have totally replaced themselves. Assuming that's true, assuming that process is always going on, you're not the same hunk of matter that you were in the past. So what follows from 1 and 2 is this, that if physicalism is true, no person is the same person that they were 10 minutes ago or 10 years ago. That's a pretty radical claim, and intuitively many of us want to say that 4 is true. Wait a minute. Of course, we are the same people that we were 10 minutes ago or 10 years ago. Um, yeah, maybe I've changed in lots of ways, but I'm the same person. I shouldn't change my name every 10 minutes because I became a different person. So it follows from that that physicalism must be false. Okay, so here's what we've seen in this argument. This argument says if physicalism is true, then this first account of personal identity must be true. A person is somebody who has all the same physical parts. But of course, that would lead to the denial of all personal identity, according to the argument. And so the dualist posits this other answer, and that is physicalism is false. And what gives us personal identity is a non-physical component, a soul, which doesn't change. Now, Van Inwagen wants to say, hey, there's a third way here. You can be a physicalist without being committed to premise one here. And here's his idea. His idea is that people, human persons, are organisms. In other words, it's not really sufficient just to think of what a person is as a hunk of matter. Sure, organisms are composed exclusively of matter, but they're more than just these material chunks. An organism can change its physical parts and yet still remain the same organism. As long as the parts are all working together to accomplish the same purpose, sustain life, then it still counts as the same organism, says Van Inwagen. And if that's how we think of what the human person is, then we can give a physicalist account that doesn't rely on dualism, but still maintains the possibility of personal identity through time. Okay, so that's his story. Now, that's an interesting idea. I think we could ask questions about that, like, well, who says an organism can change its physical parts and yet still be the same organism? Maybe not, but whatever. I just want to show you what might motivate these different views. Now, let me go on to Locke's view. According to Locke, the self is really defined by memory or identity through time. He says, for as far as any intelligent being can repeat the idea of any past action with the same consciousness it had of it at first, and with the same consciousness it has of any present action, so far it is the same personal self. In other words, if you can remember doing something, you did do it, and you are identical with the person that did do it. If you can't remember doing something, then you didn't do it. Let me say that again. If you can't remember doing something, it wasn't you that did it. You are not identical with the person that did that act. So Locke's idea is that we're all kind of immediately aware of ourselves in the present, and we have memories of ourselves in the past, and that's what makes us identical, is that memory connection. Now here's a couple important important implications of Locke's view. According to Locke's view, the same consciousness can unite several bodies or several substances simultaneously into one person. So, for example, right now I'm conscious of, feeling in my fingertips and in my toes, right? And those are like two different, body parts. But they're united into one person by my consciousness of them simultaneously. And here's another implication. The same consciousness can also be continued in a succession of several bodies or substances. The idea here is that, look, yeah, even if my body undergoes changes, I lose all my cells, well, I've got the same consciousness. And so my personal identity is not affected by the change in body parts. Now, it should be said here that Locke's view is a dualist view, right? This is a view that says the body is not identical with the person. He's a dualist, and so that's why really the body is, it's not essential to who you are. It's your mind, it's your consciousness. So another interesting implication of Locke's view is that basically, a mind-body switch is conceivable. you could have the Freaky Friday situation where Annabelle gets switched into her mother's body and her mother gets switched into Annabelle's body. I show that clip in class when I teach this. You can go watch it yourself. The movie Freaky Friday. For Locke actually came up with that idea first. He gives the example of, let's say, a prince and a cobbler. If they switch minds, if they switch consciousnesses, so that the cobbler now has all the memories of what the prince did, it's the prince in the cobbler's body. Now, he wants to say they would still be different men, because he uses the word men to refer to kind of your physical existence, but the persons would now be in switched bodies. All right. Now, Locke is really serious about this. He says, if you don't remember something, it wasn't you that did it. So he says, suppose I wholly lose the memory of some parts of my life beyond a possibility of retrieving them, so that perhaps I shall never be conscious of them again. Yet, am I not the same person that did those actions? Locke says, no, you're not the same person that did those actions. You may be the same physical man or woman, but you are not the same person. And so he says actually that the laws recognize this distinction, because say if you plead temporary insanity, you're not going to be treated the same as if you didn't. He says the laws don't punish the madman for the sober man's actions, nor the sober man for the mad. Because the law, he says, recognizes that two persons have existed in the same body. The sober man is not the one who committed the crime. That was the crazy person. So we shouldn't punish the sober person for what he didn't do. Now, that's an interesting and debatable implication, but here's an important point. However you go on personal identity is going to affect how you think about moral responsibility, because it seems like you want to hold the same person responsible only for what they did, and not hold a person responsible for what another person did. All right, when I come back, when we come back in our next video, I'm going to talk about Hume.